In the summer of 1997, a microphone anchored at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean picked up a sound. It rose out of the dark, climbed in pitch for about a minute, and then it was gone. It should have been simple to explain. The people listening had spent years learning every ordinary voice of the ocean, and this one stopped them cold. Nothing that size was supposed to be down there making a sound at all. It was louder than a blue whale, the loudest animal that has ever lived. And it had been heard by sensors more than 3,000 miles apart. Something in the deep had made a noise big enough to cross an entire ocean. They gave it a name. They called it the Bloop. And it was not alone. Down there in the cold and the black, the instruments kept catching others like the whistle, the slow down, the train, and Julia. A whole catalog of voices with no bodies attached to them. For years, nobody on Earth could say what a single one of them was. This is the story of the sounds in the deep ocean that no one could explain. It is the story of a monster that turned out to be real, just not the monster anyone was expecting. And it is the story of one voice still out there in the dark tonight that we have never once been able to answer. The ocean keeps its secrets. But every so often, if you are listening, it lets one slip. To understand the Bloop, you first have to understand how anyone was listening at all. Because the deep ocean is not a place we can watch. Sunlight gives out a few hundred feet down, and below that there is nothing to see for miles in any direction. But sound is a different story. Sound loves the deep. There is a layer in the ocean a little more than half a mile down where cold water and building pressure bend sound waves back on themselves and trap them. Scientists call it the SOFAR channel. A noise that slips into that layer does not fade the way it would in open air. It travels. In the 1940s, two researchers set off small charges of explosive inside that channel and heard them clearly 900 miles away. The United States Navy understood exactly what that meant. If a low sound could travel most of the width of a country through that channel, then a network of microphones resting on the seafloor could listen for the one thing the Navy feared most in the 1950s: Soviet submarines. So they built it. A secret grid of hydrophones wired to the ocean floor across the Atlantic and the Pacific, listening around the clock. They called it the Sound Surveillance System. For decades, its very existence was classified. It was one of the sharpest ears of the entire Cold War, and almost no one knew it was there. And then the Cold War ended, and the Navy did something remarkable. It let the scientists in. In the early 1990s, a team at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was handed access to those Cold War ears. Their leader was an oceanographer named Christopher Fox, working out of a marine lab in Newport, Oregon. Fox and his colleagues were not hunting submarines. They were hunting volcanoes, because the middle of the ocean is on fire. Along the mid-ocean ridge, a seam of cracked and erupting rock that runs around the whole planet like the stitching on a baseball. The seafloor is constantly splitting open. Those eruptions make sound, and with the Navy's hydrophones and soon a set of their own self-recording microphones anchored across the equatorial Pacific, Fox's team could finally hear the planet breathing underwater. They listened to earthquakes no one on land ever felt. They listened to lava meeting seawater in the dark. Year by year, they built up a library of the ocean's ordinary noises, until they knew its voice the way you know the sound of your own house at night. Which is exactly how they knew, the instant they heard it, that the Bloop did not belong. The Bloop arrived in the summer of 1997. It appeared on the self-recording hydrophones spread across the equatorial Pacific, and it was so powerful that instruments more than 3,000 miles apart all caught the same event. In the raw data, it lasted only about a minute, a sound that started low, swept upward in pitch, and then vanished. When the team sped the recording up so that human ears could take it in, the thing that unsettled them was how alive it sounded. It did not have the mechanical churn of a ship's propeller. It did not have the sharp snap of an undersea quake. It rose and swelled with a kind of organic swoop, the way a living call rises and falls. If you had to guess blind, you would guess it came from something breathing. But nothing that breathes could be that loud. The loudest animal on Earth is the blue whale, a creature nearly the length of a basketball court, whose calls reach 188 decibels and can carry across 1,000 miles of open sea. The bloop was louder still. Christopher Fox chose his words carefully. The sound profile, he said, did resemble a living creature, but whatever produced it would have to be far more powerful than any animal alive. Sit with that sentence for a second, because there are only two ways to read it. Either the sound was not an animal at all, or it was an animal larger than anything science had ever put a name to. The internet knew exactly which answer it preferred. The bloop had been traced to a desolate reach of the South Pacific, far off the southern tip of South America, one of the emptiest stretches of water anywhere on the planet, thousands of miles from the nearest human being. And people noticed something about that lonely patch of sea. It sat in the same vast forgotten corner of the ocean, where 70 years earlier, the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft had placed a fictional, sunken city. In his story, that city is the tomb where a sleeping monster god lies waiting at the bottom of the sea to wake. That was all it took. A real, unexplained, impossibly loud sound, rising out of the exact part of the ocean a famous author had promised us a sleeping sea monster. The bloop stopped being a footnote in an oceanography journal and became a full-blown legend. It spread across message boards and magazine covers and late-night television. NOAA's own researchers, who had only ever described the sound in careful technical language, suddenly found themselves being asked whether they had recorded a living kraken. Fox never believed in the monster. As early as 2001, he was telling reporters that his best guess had nothing to do with biology at all. He thought the bloop was ice. But a hunch is not proof, and for years the proof simply did not exist. So the sound sat there in the record, officially unexplained, loud enough to cross an ocean and strange enough to keep a myth alive. And while the world argued about sea monsters, the same hydrophones kept pulling up more of them. They came with names that sounded like a code. Each one was a distinct signature in the data, a sound the ocean made that no one had asked for, and the scientists labeled them the way you might label tracks on a record. There was Train, caught in March of 1997. It rose to a steady droning pitch and simply held it, like a distant locomotive rolling across a bridge that was not there. There was Slowdown, recorded that May, a sound that did exactly what its name promises. Over about 7 minutes, it sagged lower and lower in frequency, winding down like a great machine losing power. There was Whistle in July. Only a single hydrophone ever caught it, which meant it could never be triangulated and never located. It happened once in one ear and was gone. There was Julia in the spring of 1999, loud enough to wash across the entire array for nearly 3 full minutes. And running underneath all of it, there was Upsweep, a long series of rising tones the instruments had been picking up since 1991. Upsweep had a strange habit. It grew louder in the spring and the autumn and quieter in between, a sound that seemed to keep the seasons and no one could say why. Laid out side by side, they built a genuinely unsettling picture. Here was the largest, darkest, least explored space on the entire planet, and it was full of noise. Not the noise of ships or weather, but deep, structured, repeating sounds. Some of them louder than any living thing should be able to make, rising out of water that no human eye had ever seen. It is worth sitting with how little we knew. We have mapped the far side of the moon in sharper detail than we have mapped our own seafloor. And here was hard evidence, recorded on real instruments, that enormous things were happening down there, on a regular schedule, completely beyond our sight. The sounds were proof of a world in motion. We just had no idea what was doing the moving. Every good mystery pulls you toward one of two conclusions. Either something extraordinary is hiding out there, or we are misreading something ordinary in an extraordinary way. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was stranger than both, because it turned out that the ocean's most monstrous sounds were being made by something with no throat, no body, and no life in it at all. The clue was hiding in the shape of the sound. As Fox and the NOAA researchers who followed him kept studying the bloop and its cousins, they kept circling back to the way the signals rose and swept. That upward slide, the one that made the bloop feel almost alive, is also exactly what you get from a very different source. Not a creature, a crack. When an iceberg breaks, it does not simply snap in half. A slab of ice the size of a city, grinding against the seafloor or tearing away from a glacier, unloads its energy in a long, complicated shudder. The ice fractures and fractures again, and the whole enormous mass rings like a struck bell. Scientists have a name for these events. They call them icequakes. And an icequake, it turns out, can be violent enough to be heard clear across an ocean. There is even a reason these ice sounds so often rise in pitch the way the bloop did. That upward sweep, the one that reads to a nervous ear as the cry of some enormous animal, is really just the acoustic fingerprint of ice fracturing under unimaginable stress. It is the shape that shattering makes when you draw it out on a graph. To test the idea, NOAA did the obvious thing. They went and listened where the ice actually is. In the 2000s, they lowered hydrophones into the Scotia Sea, off the Antarctic Peninsula, into the middle of one of the most active iceberg nurseries on the planet. And the instruments filled up with icequakes, thousands upon thousands of them. When the researchers pulled up the spectrograms, the visual fingerprints of all that shattering Antarctic ice, they found signatures that looked strikingly like the bloop. One by one, the monsters fell. Train was an enormous iceberg grounded in the Ross Sea. Slowdown was a berg dragging to a halt as it ran aground. Julia was an iceberg that had run aground off Antarctica. And the bloop, the loudest and most famous of them all, the sound that launched 1,000 sea monster stories, was most likely a giant iceberg cracking apart somewhere between the Bransfield Strait and the Ross Sea. Investigators pointed at one likely stretch of coast in particular, a place called Cape Adair, long known as a source of exactly these kinds of cryogenic signals. There was no beast. There had never been a beast. The most alien sound ever pulled from the deep ocean was made by frozen water doing what frozen water does at the bottom of the world, on a scale so vast that a single crack could shake the sea for 3,000 miles. It would be easy to feel cheated by that. A monster would have made a better story. But look harder at the answer, because the answer is not small. It means the poles are so loud, so full of splitting and grinding ice, that Antarctica effectively has a voice in the deep ocean, and that voice can travel the length of a sea. And it means those sounds are becoming more common, not less. As the planet warms and more ice breaks away every year, there is more cracking, more grinding, more thunder rolling silently through the SOFAR channel. The bloop was never a warning from a sleeping god, but it may have been an early warning of something far more real. The ocean's great monster was ice. And yet, the deep was not finished talking, because there is one voice down there that no iceberg can explain. It was first heard in 1989 on the same kind of Cold War hydrophones that had caught everything else. But this one was different from the very first note, because this one was unmistakably a whale. There was no confusing it with ice or machinery, only the long, mournful call of a great baleen whale moving through the North Pacific. There was just one problem. It was singing at the wrong pitch. A blue whale calls at somewhere around 15 to 25 hertz, a rumble so low that you feel it in your chest more than you hear it. A fin whale sits in that same deep register. Those low voices are the deepest notes in the ocean, and they are tuned to one another, so that whales scattered across hundreds of miles of black water can still find their own kind. But this one whale was calling at 52 hertz, more than double the frequency, high and strange, and entirely its own. At the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, a marine biologist named William Watkins, one of the founders of the whole science of listening to whales, set out to follow it. Season after season, he and his team tracked the 52 hertz call as it wandered the North Pacific, from the waters off California up toward the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. They followed it for 12 years. In one season alone, it traveled more than 6,000 miles. And in all of that time, Across all of those years, they never once recorded another whale answering it back. Think about what a whale's call is actually for. It is a question thrown out into the dark. Where are you? I am here. Every other whale in that ocean was tuned to hear the deep, low voices of its own kind. The 52 Hertz whale was calling out in a voice pitched too high for any of them to recognize. It was not that it had nothing to say. It was that it may have spent its entire life saying it in a language with exactly one speaker. The press called it the loneliest whale in the world, and the name stuck. Scientists, to their credit, are quick to caution that we do not truly know its story. Maybe it is a hybrid, part blue whale and part fin, born with a voice caught between two worlds. Maybe others like it are out there, and we have simply never caught them. Maybe it hears the others perfectly well, and they hear it. And the loneliness is only in our own heads, a sad story we have painted onto an animal we cannot see. William Watkins died in 2004, still not certain what he had been chasing. But the call is still out there. The bloop was solved. The monsters were ice. The great mystery of the sounds in the deep turned out to have an answer, cold and clear and almost disappointing, all of them, except one. Somewhere in the North Pacific tonight, in a voice that no other whale seems built to hear, something is still calling and still waiting, and has never once received a reply. That is the thing about the deep ocean. It will hand you an answer if you listen long enough and closely enough, but it always keeps one back. If this pulled you under, subscribe to Blues Below and come with us on the next descent. There is a whole ocean of secrets down here, and we are only just beginning to learn how to listen. The ocean keeps its secrets. Stay down here with us, and we will keep chasing them into the dark.